Mark Smith is now here. He's the host of the Four Boxes Diner YouTube channel, also author of the book, First They Came for the Gun Owners. Mark, good to have you back with us. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Vince, for having me on. A lot to talk about. Merrick Garland, not only am I glad he is not on the United States Supreme Court because he's a partisan hack, I'm now excited because he also doesn't understand federal law, apparently, based on that statement you just played for the audience.
Yeah, they say they're recategorizing someone who is, quote, engaged in the business of selling guns. What does this mean to you? Just take it down to brass tacks for us.
Okay, the bottom line is this. If you're in the business of selling guns, you're required and have been required for decades to get a license. That license, Vince, is called a federal firearms license. Okay, if you're in the business, you're making money, you're making profits, it's your job, you got to get a license. Now, here's the key, and this is why I made the observation that Merrick Garland doesn't appear to understand the law. If you have an FFL, Vince, and you sell a gun, it doesn't matter where you sell the gun, at a gun show, in your house, in a store, on the street, in your car. If you have an FFL and you sell any gun, Vince, you have to run a background check. So the notion of a gun show loophole has never existed when it comes to gun dealers, because gun dealers always have to run a background check. And if you're in the business of selling guns, you have to get an FFL. So what are we talking about here with this proposed or this new rule? The answer is, at the end of the day, I think this is much ado about nothing, because it doesn't really change anything. The criminals who do not get their license, do not get their guns from FFLs, they get their guns on the black market. They are not going to subject themselves to a background check with anyone. So it's not going to impact criminals at all. And then think about this for 1 second, Vince. You've done a great job covering this story. On the one hand, you have this anti-gun Biden administration saying every day there's too many guns in America, there's too many gun dealers in America, and now today they tried to change the definition of gun dealer and brought it out to create more gun dealers in America. And again, it just goes to show you how they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. But the good news is I see it, even though I oppose all gun control related laws in all respects as a general matter for violating the Second Amendment, the reality is I'm not sure if this is going to matter in the real world beyond the following. It's going to create additional confusion. And the only reason why that confusion is good for the Biden administration is what it allows them to tell the mainstream media that doesn't understand anything about guns or gun laws that they've closed some loophole that never existed, right? So it's a PR plan. The other thing, of course, is the confusion will make it harder for law-abiding Americans who want to comply with the law and get it right. It will create confusion for those people who just simply want to follow the law. And it will have no bearing whatsoever, no change whatsoever, Vince, on the criminals who are engaging in the violent thuggery and are not being put in prison by this administration.
You know, I hadn't contemplated one of the points that you made just a moment ago, which is now they have to lose the talking point that there's a gun show loophole. Oh, because Merrick Garland and Joe Biden closed it. How could there be a gun show loophole? They just closed it. Move on. But of course, they won't give up that talking point. It doesn't even matter. My question fundamentally, and I think you're kind of getting at it for me, is this toothless in the sense that the status quo continues? The same, everything's going to be the same. Or are they expanding the definition of who's engaged in gun sales so much that they're going to criminalize the private transfer of guns?
Well, I think what they really want to do is how to explain this, Vince. I don't think it's necessarily going to create additional criminal problems for ordinary Americans. What it's going to do is make people more uncomfortable in buying or selling guns with their neighbors or family members or whatever it is. It's going, or just to disposing of a collection. It's
right.
going to create additional hurdles and confusion. And whenever that happens with ordinary middle-class Americans that want to follow the law, it makes them scared. And again, never forget that the purpose, one of the main goals of the anti-gun movement in America, and I write about this in First They Came from the Gun Owners, and I talk about this on my YouTube channel, The Four Boxes Diner, is they want to discourage a gun culture, a self-defense gun culture. And one of the ways you accomplish that, Vince, in my view, is you make everything about it hard to do. You make it hard to buy guns. You make it hard to sell guns. You make it hard to learn about guns. You make it hard to read magazines and watch YouTube videos about guns. This is the goal of they just want to destroy America's longstanding gun culture. And this is just another attempt to do so by creating confusion in the marketplace where people don't know exactly what they need to do to comply with the law. And they get scared, and therefore they don't want to get involved. And that is exactly a big part of what the anti-gun movement wants to do, is make people scared from getting involved and protect themselves and exercising their Second Amendment rights in that Bill of Rights.
Yeah, I mean, and they're always trying to ban components of guns that, in fact, make guns more accurate, for instance, and thus safer to wield. And they'll try and ban those things and convince us that it's for our safety that they're banning the things that make guns more safe.
That's exactly right. I mean, they want to ban anything that makes guns more effective for law-abiding Americans, because anytime you make a gun, and think about this for a second, they say, well, we don't want to make guns more effective for the criminals. But again, we do not measure or evaluate constitutional rights by virtue of how some gangbanger can misbehave with it, right? We measure constitutional rights by how American citizens can exercise them lawfully. That's the focus, and that's what the Supreme Court jurisprudence says. You focus on how Mark and Vince exercise our, among other things, Second Amendment rights. We don't look to how criminals engage in them or how they can be misused. That's just not how the Constitution works. Now, if you misuse a gun, you defame someone, guess what? You can be sued. Go to prison. There's remedies for that if you abuse it. But you don't punish you don't punish Americans for the acts of other people.
It is illegal for the United States federal government to keep a gun registry of American citizens who own weapons. Yet I've noticed that every time a gun is used in the commission of a crime, within minutes we typically get some sort of headline telling us where the gun was bought, who owned it, under what circumstances they purchased it. And I always whenever I see those headlines, I think, I thought they didn't keep a gun registry. I thought we weren't. How is it that they have all of this very granular data on of where this weapon was purchased and how it was used? And so what's the answer? Does the federal government keep a lot more data than they let on?
Well, yes, it is illegal for them to have a federal registry. And I think what we're confusing here is there are crime guns, which are guns that are used in crimes. Yeah. And that's not to be confused with guns that are traced. If you look at certain states, they will trace any gun that comes into their possession. And then what they try to do is they try to pretend that whenever they're tracing a gun, they suggest that is a crime gun. But that's a sleight of hand that we see in the anti-gun media sometimes, where they try to confuse the mere fact that someone is tracing a gun, like law enforcement is tracing guns, with that it's a crime gun. But in many instances, law enforcement traces all guns, and usually those traces lead to literally nothing. Because if you think about it, you have a major manufacturer sells a gun to a major distributor, then sells it to a major, a retail store with an FFL. All of this is, all of these people have federal licenses to engage in this business. So then that FFL, it goes from the licensed manufacturer to a licensed distributor to a licensed retailer. Then that licensed retailer sells the gun to someone, and that has to clear a NICS check, because again, there is no background, that you have to be a background check if you're an FFL. Now that person has the gun. Now if that person or his family member or his friend or whatever it is goes out and breaks the law, well, again, even if you can trace it back to that first retailer or that distributor or to that manufacturer, it tells you nothing about whether a crime is committed. If someone misuses a gun, like if they misuse a baseball bat, finding out that they bought the gun or the baseball bat at some store, what does that do to solve crime? It literally does nothing. It tells you the chain of distribution legally, but what does it tell you about the crime? Absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all. Yet they keep all this data. So let me, I'm going to play some audio for you. This is, by now I'm certain you've heard this. This is a woman by the name of Lily Tang Williams. She is a survivor of Mao's China. And there was a debate earlier this week at Dartmouth that involved the gun control activist by the name of David Hogg. At the end, there was a Q&A, and this lovely woman stepped up to the microphone, and here's what she had to say to Mr. Hogg.
Hi, my name is Lily Tang Williams. Welcome to my live free or die state. Actually, I am a Chinese immigrant who survived communism. And under Mao, 40 million people were starving to death after he sold communism to them, and 20 million people died, murdered during his Cultural Revolution. So my question to you, David, is that can you guarantee me, a gun owner tonight, our government in the U.S., in D.C., will never become a tyrannical government? Can you guarantee that to me?
There's no way I can ever guarantee that any government will not be tyrannical.
Well, then the debate on gun control is over, because I will never give up my guns. Never, never. And you should go to China to see how gun control works for dictatorship of CCP.
Mark, have you ever heard it said so succinctly?
I think that was a perfect observation, and the U.S. Supreme Court recognizes, as did our founding fathers, that one of the greatest checks in preventing a government from going tyrannical is an armed population. As long as the population is armed, they cannot be readily converted from citizens into serfs or slaves. And that's why when the Supreme Court talks about these things in Heller, McDonald, and Bruin, they reference the fact that the reason why we have a Second Amendment and the whole Bill of Rights and the entire Constitution, of course, these are all anti-tyrannical efforts. The reason why our Constitution exists, not just the Second Amendment, but the whole Constitution, and we checks and separation of powers, checks and balances, all these things that have been built in. These are safeguards to stop the government from going tyrannical. That does happen. Empires do fall. We may not think it will ever occur here, but if you say that, you are being naive and ignorant of history throughout time. There are many instances. I mean, there's countless examples of countries and governments that go haywire. Maybe they become tyrannical. Maybe they fall apart. Maybe you have massive civil disorder. All of this stuff was discussed by our founding fathers, including early Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, who wrote the early definitive work on the U.S. Constitution. He was important because Justice Story is the famous justice who wrote the Amistad decision that freed the African slaves that were captured by the Spaniards. And of course, the Steven Spielberg movie Amistad was based in large part upon the work of Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, who thought that the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms was the palladium of liberty for a republic.
Right, and as you point out, tyranny is not the only awful conclusion for so many countries. It's also sometimes it's civilizational collapse, anarchy, also foreign invasion. I mean, how many of our adversaries have to factor into their calculus about whether or not they would invade America, the reality that so many Americans are armed and ready to defend themselves?
And tyranny can go down to the street level. I mean, what I like to explain then is that the Second Amendment is about thwarting tyranny in all its forms. Now, that tyranny could be a street criminal coming up to you to hit you over the head. That places you in an act of war, right? You're in a position of war with someone that's trying to take your life. It could be a wild animal trying to attack you. It could be a gang. It could, and then it could be foreign invaders. It could be any of these things. Tyranny and evil comes in all sorts of guises and forms. And the Second Amendment is there. The right to self-defense is there. So you have an opportunity, an option at least, to try to fend and protect yourself against all forms of tyranny, whatever that tyranny manifests in. And that's what the Founding Fathers understood, and that's what they wrote about, and that's why we have a whole Constitution, including the right to keep and bear arms in the Second Amendment.
It can't be brought up enough, and I'm so glad you're doing it today and always. Mark Smith, constitutional attorney, host of the Four Boxes Diner YouTube channel, and the author of the book, First They Came for the Gun Owners. Sir, as always, thank you very much. Good to talk to you today.